Thank you. So now I hope that sound and picture will work. And I'm very glad to finally be here today with you people in the room and to those of you who follow along through Zoom. Good to have people with us through distance and people here in the room. And it's a quite fascinating thing that you do here in Norway, where you have a trial lecture that the committee decides the topic for you, because then you have to dig into a topic. Obviously, I'm familiar with Swedish social democracy, but I haven't studied Danish or Norwegian that thoroughly. So that has given me a chance to find new patterns that I have found really fascinating and interesting. So I suggest that we get right into business. This is the picture that I chose to open this trial lecture. And it's really telling, I think, because you see from the left, Einar Gerhardsen, Prime Minister of Norway, and Hans Christian Hansen, Prime Minister of Denmark, and Tage Erlander, Prime Minister of Sweden. This is social democracy at its peak. It governs the three Scandinavian nations, and they have solved most of the challenges that they have found important of equality, economic equality. And now it's time to take the next step. And it's pretty obvious in this picture which nation finds itself most called to take the lead in this search for tomorrow and tomorrow's values. So let's see where we end up here. Let me begin with some definitions. Firstly, Scandinavia. I was supposed to talk about the Scandinavian social democracies. And if you ask Encyclopedia Britannica, that consists of the two countries on the Scandinavian peninsula, Norway and Sweden, with the addition of Denmark. So that's where I'm going to keep my concentration in today's lecture. Also, social democracies. We have three major parties. In Denmark, they have changed names back and forth, but now it's called Socialdemokratiet. And in Norway, we have Arbeiderpartiet, and in Sweden, we have Sveriges Socialdemokratiska Arbetarparti, in short, SAP. These are the three major parties, and I'm going to show you how their influence have developed over time. We're going to talk about the 20th century, that sort of defines itself, but I'm going to keep the focus on the period between the 1930s and the 1970s, because this is where social democracy had its golden age, as several scholars call it. We're going to talk about values. We have the values of equality and solidarity. I'm going to use them more or less as they are used in the source material. And you see that some of the words have different meanings, both among different actors and different contexts and different times. And especially the value of equality has very differing Scandinavian words when used in the sources. Solidarity is always called solidarity in all languages. And about autonomy, which is obviously the central word in my study. I use the same definition as I do in my dissertation, the intention to increase the independence of the individual. And this is propagated in different ways in the source material and in Scandinavian social democracies, with a very special emphasis in one of the nations, as we will see. So, in social democracy, there has been, ever since the beginning, some quite typical struggles over values and strategies. What should we put our focus in as social democratic parties? For instance, to begin with, should we choose the path of reformism or revolution? In the beginning, there wasn't two separate socialist movements. There was one socialist movement. Some of them were revolutionary, some of the actors were reformist. And they had to figure out, are we as a joint movement going to go for revolution, or are we going to go for democratic change? And after a while, as you know, the movement split into two, one revolutionary and one reformistic. Should we strive towards the utopia, the vision, the goal that we have in front of us, or should we try to be pragmatic and avoid striving for the most utopian goals, which is the most successful way to fulfill our political goals? Should we strive towards materialistic goals, the Marxist view of history, materialism, and the how we view the production forces and so on? Or should we work with ideals? Should we strive mostly towards the goals that we think are ideologically most important? There is also a struggle when you get in power as a social democratic party. Should we do all we can very quickly when we get a government power to change as much as possible? Or should we be slower and build for more long-term power so that we can keep power for as long as possible? That was a really important decision, for instance, in Sweden in 1920, when Hjalmar Branting became the first prime minister, social democratic, when they had a new and very radical party program. They also had to figure out, we are a socialist party on a Marxist base, but should we agree to accept part of capitalism, even though we don't like it? Or should we continually work towards planned economy? Or should we include amounts of market economy? And obviously, where should we find ourselves on the left-right scale? In Sweden, at least, we have a constant debate within the party of left-wing social democrats and right-wing social democrats. And it's important for both phalanx is to have the power over the party. And it's also a question of what should we build our foundations on? Are there connections to Christian values that we could build on in social democracy? Or should we go entirely for secular humanist values? There's a really interesting debate in the Swedish party Congress in 1956 that I mentioned in the dissertation. Where should we put our emphasis at our basis? And finally, should we go for collectivism, treating the people as a class, as a group, or should we go for individualism? That is the constant battle that I have been searching for. Should we go for the group, or should the individual be at the center? Or should it be possible to combine collectivism and individualism? And there has been efforts for that. So I'm going to show you some examples from quantitative studies, not mine, and qualitative studies to give you sort of examples on how these values have been propagated and the results they've had in practical policy. And I'm going to begin by giving you an example on the left-right scale, how the political parties in Scandinavia have presented themselves. And here you see statistics from the Manifesto Research Group, who work with quantitative methods. And you see their results in numbers. So if we begin with Denmark up here, you see compared to the other nations, they are sort of in the middle. They're not radically left, but they're somewhat positioned left during this golden era of social democracy from the 1940s to the 1970s. But if you go down to Norway, you will find that the Norwegian Arbeiderparti, they position themselves very far left during the 1940s and 1950s. If you compare to the other nations, it's only New Zealand and Sweden who find themselves equally far left. But if we move to the second part of this period, the 1960s and the 1970s, you see that Norway is still far left, but Sweden have become even further left among the social democratic parties, if you count them quantitatively, like the Manifesto Research Group do. The only party in the social democratic group who are even further left, you see, is France, who is sort of collapsing in fragmented social democratic parties or socialist parties at this time. But in Sweden, the party manages to stay in power and are at the same time very far left on the scale. Here are some statistics on how social democracy has fared in Europe and in the Western world. This is taken from statistics of election results. And you see that it's very clear that the development is going up, up, up until the 1940s. Then for 3 or 4 decades, they stay on their peak in Central Europe and Western and Northern Europe. And then it falls for each decade. You could say that demography is catching up. The working class is not as large as it was, and social democracy need to find new groups to have their votes. I've got 3 graphs up here showing the Scandinavian nations. In the red, you have Denmark. And you see, they begin as a really strong party in elections in the 1930s. Then they drop somewhat. And my conclusion from what I've read the last 2 weeks that I have to prepare for Norway and Denmark is that they are the only social democratic party to actively have worked together with the Third Reich. They decided to stay in government during the war, during the occupation. And that seems to have cost them votes from the voters, which they never have caught up since then. In Norway, the blue, you see that it's steadily growing up until the 1950s and then going backwards, but stronger than in Denmark over time. And the yellow graph is Sweden, a very strong performance from the 1930s and onwards to the 1970s, stronger than in all the other nations over time, just the 1950s that Norway peaks up above. But Swedish social democracy, they are really strong in maintaining power and keeping the voters. And there are obviously several reasons for this, and we're not going to go into those now. But I'm going to give you an example of how Sweden is a particular example, also described in this book that I found interesting by Sherry Berman about the social democracies in Europe during the 20th century. She uses a poster from the Swedish Social Democrats on the top of this page of the cover of this book, and she mentions why Sweden and Scandinavia are particular examples. She says that it was only in Scandinavia, and particularly in Sweden, that a unified party embraced the new approach, which is reformist socialism, wholeheartedly. This is why one must turn to Sweden to observe the full dimensions and potential of the new and truly social democratic alternative. And that's also why I've picked my study, obviously, to study Sweden, because it's such a peculiar example of one party performing its power. But one thing that I've also noted in my study, and that she notes as well, is how the social democratic hegemony has been so strong. And this is how she puts it. Perhaps the SAP's greatest success, however, has been to preserve a sense of social democratic distinctiveness in Sweden, rather than questioning whether such social democratic concepts are worthwhile. Political debate in Sweden has tended to be about whether the socialists or the bourgeois parties are best able to implement them. That's a great success in creating a hegemony in a nation, that you present your politics and you also make the other parties accept your political vision. And this is how Sweden has been such a particular example of social democratic success. It's also particular and successful when we study it in this quantitative way. This is a graph taken showing predicted political performances, which means that the further right you go in this graph, the more political office, the more success you have with the voters, which is supposed to lead to political action. And here you have Norway. They are very popular with the voters compared to other nations, but they haven't managed to put their values in practical policy as much as the graph says that you should. Denmark, on the other hand, they don't have the same success among voters and among the possibility that they should have, but they have performed better and been more successful in performing their politics. Sweden then, good voting, good possibilities to include people in power, and also very successful in performing their values in practical policy. So this is also how Swedish social democracy have proved more successful in propagating their own values in practical policy. So if we start out from the beginning, when the social democratic parties in Scandinavia begin, we're back in the late 1800s. Actually, in 1876, Denmark are first on the pitch. And their first program is called Gimle-programmet, very close to the German Gotha program. And what they present here is a basic socialist policy. And what is in focus is the working class, saying that all other classes are for them just a reactionary mass. This is the description of socialism in the late 1800s. They also had some kind of focus that we could call autonomy in the long run, especially when they express their views on religion, where they demand religion declared as a private matter, a formulation that is going to be really influential in social democracy in the Scandinavian nations, especially in Sweden, up till today, actually. In Norway, they begin 7, 8, 9 years later, and their first program is basically a translation of the Danish program. Also the same class-based and Marxist opposition to capitalism. They also share the same description on religion, which is more autonomy-focused, which means that they call for abolishment of the state church and abandoning the school teaching of Christianity. Also topics that will run in the coming decades, not least in Sweden. They begin in 1889, but they don't adopt the first program until 1897. You see that they have taken inspiration from Norway and from Denmark, and then obviously from Germany. But, and this goes all along through the political programs, party programs during the 20th century, that the Swedish programs are more elaborate, especially in the general principles. They introduce by explaining their ideology very thoroughly, share the same socialist base, have an individualistic view on religion, remove the state church and school system, and education should be reformed according to their policies. So if we go into these 3 values then that I'm supposed to cover mostly during this lecture, let's begin with equality. And if we begin with Norway, where we happen to be today, you see that from the beginning to up till late in the 20th century, you have a basic socialist understanding of equality. If we begin 1900 exactly, they adopt enormous amounts of new party programs in Norway compared to other nations. Almost every party congress, they adopt a new program, which is often just a small revision of the last one. But in 1900, Arbeiderpartiet says that we work for equal rights and equal plights for all, with no regard to gender. And we work for the removal of all differences between classes. So equality is a clear focus in their policy from the beginning. In 1930, you remember that I said how Norwegian social democracy was very leftward during the 1930s and 40s. And you see this, how they describe that they need the workers to unite against capitalism, not primarily for equality now, but they say that through class struggle, we defend their daily interests. They pursue this struggle to the point where the working people are lords over the land and means of production and free from the capitalist system. That is a radical description of societal change. They keep the same program in 1939, but they tone down the radical tone and use more pragmatic means, but towards the same goal of equality, but very close connected to the class struggle. They keep the same program up until 1969, where they also explain the socialist equality, but now with some kind of tone of autonomy, saying the goal for the Norwegian Arbeiderparti is a socialist society. This is a society where democracy rules in all areas, where there is equality between all humans and groups, and with the largest possible freedom for individuals, as long as it doesn't harm others. So equality is a central value, so is individualism or autonomy, but under an equal banner. In Sweden, we see a much stronger move of egalitarian values during this period. They start out with a clear Marxist focus in the party program of 1944, and possibly we're going to discuss this more in the afternoon. But here it's stated in a Marxist description of society that the guidelines for the strivings of social democracy should be societal influence over production forces, participation in ownership for the workers, a planned production, and equality for the citizens. So equality is promoted, but it's under a very clear Marxist basis. When we move up to the 1960s, here is where the big change happens in values in Swedish social democracy, which separates it from other Scandinavian nations and possibly other nations as well. I haven't studied those as close. Here it says that the demand for equality must above all signify the individual's right and opportunity to develop oneself according to one's personal disposition. So it's a very clear move of equality into an autonomous perspective. And this becomes even clearer during the 1960s, where you have this report by Alva Myrdal, who leads the Equality Report and committee that is presented at the party congress in 1969. It's called Towards Equality in its English translation. And it says that the aim of this report, which is called Equality, jämlikhet in Swedish, is to give each citizen equal freedom of choice to shape his own future. And its aim is further to introduce freedom from the pressure of external circumstances. So a clear move into autonomous understanding of equality in the 1960s and the 1970s, because this report has large influence in policy during the 1970s. In Denmark, you see a slightly different understanding of equality. I found this party program from 1961, Vejen Frem. I wonder if parties would have a picture of petrol cars as their main picture for the modern society nowadays, but then they did. So in 1961, they described how equality was important to them in a socialist understanding, but this is more community-based than in Sweden. The first sentence in the party program says that democratic socialism has the goal of liberating the human, securing their safety, and provide opportunity of free expression with responsibility for the community. That is the beginning of it. And they go on to say that the basis for democratic socialism is constituted by respect for the human being and the will to create equal opportunities for everyone during the whole existence. So equality is still central, but it's connected to community. And it says so further in the program that it is of crucial importance to both individual and society that good conditions are created for the life of the family. Still, those of you who have read the dissertation, you see that the Social Democrats in Sweden, they keep on to a traditional view of family in the beginning of the 1960s as well, until things turn over into a new view at the end of that decade. But Denmark keeps on with this view, which is more community-oriented understanding of equality. If we talk about autonomy then, it's very obvious that Sweden find themselves at the forefront of this development. And you see this, obviously there is in Scandinavia a kind of general shift away from equality values to freedom values during the 1960s. Because as I said, the picture from the beginning was a meeting with the 3 Scandinavian prime ministers in Malmö in the late 1950s. They have figured out that we have more or less eradicated the social or economic inequalities. Now we need to take a new step for a new time, and where do we go from that? And that has led to a development where equality values sort of are exchanged by freedom values in general, but particularly in Sweden, these freedom values are focused on the individual and is independent from outer spheres. Especially so in Sweden. And there are 2 factors in the party program of 1960 that are really important, because they are quoted over and over again in other social democratic documents during the 1960s and the 1970s, showing that these 2 formulations have proven central in shaping social democratic policy during the 1960s and 70s. That social democracy strives to reshape society so that the citizens are liberated from dependence of any kind of power groups beyond their control. This is a very central formulation, focusing on the independence of the individual. And secondly, there is a phrase that social democracy wishes to shape a society which provides space for each person's individuality and needs of expression. And it also aims to create a societal environment that is intended to shape free independent and creative human beings. That is also a phrase that recurs during policy in the next couple of decades. So you see here how the autonomous values are at the center of Swedish social democracy during this time, to a much larger extent than in the other nations. And in 1972, there has been quite a long battle, especially during the 1960s, on whether to continue with community-based views on family policy especially, or if they should move over to an autonomy-focused view on the family. And here at the Women's Association Congress in 1972, Olof Palme, Prime Minister, he gives his blessing to the new perspective. The Women's Association have just published their new, very radical family policy pamphlet, Familjen i framtiden, the family in the future. And at this Congress, the Prime Minister gives his endorsement to this, saying that the principle is plain. Each human shall be treated as an autonomous individual, not as an appendage to a provider. That is the new focus that shapes society and policy for the 1970s. If we move over then finally to solidarity, this is the same word in all the Scandinavian languages, but they have different understandings of it. And this is probably what I found most interesting in this preparation for this talk today, how solidarity can build on such different foundations and how they are promoted in the practical politics. In Denmark, they describe solidarity as a class-based concept, and they do so from the beginning of the 20th century. Socialdemokratiet in Denmark, they regard itself as a part of and declares itself in solidarity with the class-conscious international working class, whose mission in world history is the complete liberation of all people, without regard to gender, race, or nationality. So solidarity is an important feature in Danish social democracy. And in the beginning, it's very clear that it's solidarity with our own class. We are the movement for the working class. It continues later in the same century in Denmark. They have expanded solidarity to an international level, but also an ideological level, saying that we want to show solidarity with forces that wish to create political and economical democracy. Those are the forces that we need to show solidarity with. And we also wish to strive towards the goal of strengthening democratic socialism all across the world. That are the forces that we need to align ourselves with and show solidarity with to strengthen democratic socialism over the world. In Sweden, I was a bit surprised when I actually searched for socialism as a value, finding that this word does not exist in the party programs in the beginning of the 20th century, not until 1944. Then it turns up, but you see that it's very clearly class-based in this program, mainly written by Ernst Wigforss, which has a clear Marxist perspective. But then it grows in importance during the 1960s and 1970s and becomes really central for Olof Palme. But then you see that solidarity in his communication is mainly also directed towards the third world. This is the people and the nations and the classes that we want to show solidarity with, but it's not connected directly to family, religion, or local community. We have solidarity, but it's directed quite far away. Norway then is the most interesting example, because here solidarity is described under a Christian understanding of solidarity, which I found really surprising and very interesting. What is written in the beginning of a party program is usually considered very important because you want to introduce by something you find very valuable and central. But the final words of a party program can also be quite central. And I don't know if this is common knowledge in Norway. It's possibly that is the case, but it surprised me how at the end of the Social Democratic Party program in Arbeiderpartiet in 1969, they put their final words like this. And those of you who understand Norwegian, you can read easily. And for those of you who don't, I translate the central bits. They begin, this is the final paragraph in the party program in 1969. They begin this final paragraph by describing a Christian view on morality and how it's based on neighborly love. And they go on to say that Arbeiderpartiet sees a clear connection between the Christian message and the societal policy built on solidarity. This is something that has never appeared in a Swedish Social Democratic Party program, but the Norwegian party apparently finds a need, after the long program that they had since 1939, to introduce something new, which is something old, that they see that this should form the basis for solidarity. And they go on to say that a society built on equality, equal value and security, responsible cooperation and world peace is in accordance with the principle of neighborly love. And after this, they go on to say that how their party views Christianity as a central part of the cultural heritage in Norway, and therefore the people growing up need to have knowledge of this through school, which is very different from Sweden, who during the same period removed as much as they could of Christianity in school. So this, and they end by saying that they want to gather everyone under this view, regardless of personal beliefs. So this surprised me a lot, how solidarity in the Norwegian working class movement and social democracy was so clearly connected to Christian values. So if we move to the conclusion of the 20th century, I want to show you some statistics examples on how this autonomous understanding of equality, especially promoted in family policy, has turned out in political practice. And I'm going to show you some statistical examples and years. This is the description of the parental leave systems in the Nordic countries. And especially, I want to put the focus on when they introduced what they call in English the father's quota. That is the number of weeks or days of parental leave that are reserved to the father, and that the parents cannot decide themselves on how to distribute, but that the state decides. So this is a goal based on equality, that the sexes should be equal and the parents. It's also an example of autonomy, of disconnecting the mother from her obligations as mother and making her autonomous from the family values. It's very clearly propagated in Sweden during the 1970s. Where I've ended my study. Someone else has probably investigated it during later decades. But in the beginning of the 1990s, there was a movement in social democracy saying that we need to introduce some weeks of father's quota, weeks that the state decides in order for autonomous equality. And Norway, you see, introduced it in 1993 under Gro Harlem Brundtland, social democratic prime minister. But Sweden did not precede them, because Sweden had a bourgeois government between 1991 and 1994. But as soon as the new social democratic government was introduced, they introduced the father's quota in Sweden as well. In Denmark, they introduced the same thing in 1998, because then they had a social democratic government. But then you see, in 2002, they removed it, because then they had a liberal government who had other ideological foundations, saying that we think this is not something that we stand behind. And as far as I know, they haven't reintroduced it. Somebody else might correct me if I'm wrong. But it's interesting to see how the ideologies of the different parties behaves and handles questions of equality, autonomy within family policy. Apparently, it seems to depend on parties. I'm also going to show you a graph on how large percentage of the women are in the workforce. And if you have a policy of working and of family, it should probably lead to that a nation who promotes autonomous values in family policy should probably have a higher number of women in the workforce. And that is also the case. In Sweden, we have a higher number of women in the workforce in the late 1900s, which means that policy seems to have had consequences in that aspect. But also, it seems that politics can't control everything in society. It can use economic means, it can use different means of influencing people and people's decisions, but apparently can't influence everything, because there is another graph which covers what we call, or that scholars call anyway, it's a paradox of the welfare state paradox, which should say that in a society with a lot of equality values and a lot of autonomous values, women should probably be more common in male-dominated occupations and the other way around. But that is not the case. In Sweden, women are fewer in male-dominated occupations compared to their Nordic contemporaries, and men are fewer in female-dominated occupations. And that's a paradox. There are different hypotheses on what's the reason behind it, and I'm not going to go into them and evaluate them, but it's an interesting paradox, which sort of signifies that politics can't control everything. Values are important and politics are important, but it doesn't reach into everything. And to sum up then, we stand before history. This is the cover of the Swedish popularized version of my dissertation. An older man and a little girl who stand before what we could call the altarpiece of Swedish politics in the chamber of Swedish Parliament, and thinking about what has happened, where we are now, and where to go in the future. And the question is obviously, what values should social democracy build themselves on, and what should the rest of society wish to build the future upon? A final statistical graph to show you has to do with welfare spending, because you remember that social democracy have been struggling on whether to focus on materialistic values or ideological values. And if we only focus on materialistic values, it should have materialistic outcomes. Here you see that Sweden has the highest welfare efforts in percentage of GDP. Sweden has, through our taxation system and political decisions, had the highest public spending in welfare, which should mean that if material values are the most important, this should lead to the highest results also. But that's not the case if you compare the amount of happiness, which they do in this statistics. They fare Sweden not top, not bottom, but there are other nations with higher happiness scores. And if you compare in misery, Sweden are sort of in the middle. So that has led some people to find that materialism may not be the only values to build upon. Ideological values and ideals may be as important or even more important. And I'm going to conclude now by visiting Göran Persson, who is the last of the really successful prime ministers in Sweden. He's the last social democratic prime minister to win 40% of the votes and form a one-party social democratic government. And when looking at the new millennium at the party congress in 1997, he delivers a speech about values, about social democracy, about democracy in general, and about solidarity. And what is fascinating with this speech is that he does not endorse the autonomous values that have shaped Sweden so strongly and made Sweden the most secular individualistic nation in the world. He leads the most successful social democratic party in the world, and he concludes his speech at the party congress in 1997 by saying that when we look for the new millennium, people seem to be looking at a great vision. And I'm going to quote now, because he says, "I'm not sure that I know in detail how this should be formulated, but I know this. 2,000 years ago, a man went up on a hill outside Jerusalem. He said that the light must shine upon everyone in the house. The message in the Sermon on the Mount was crystal clear. Everyone, not just a few." And this is sort of paradoxical as well, how the prime minister of the most successful social democratic party in the world, in the most secular individualistic nation in the world, does not point to the autonomous values that has shaped Sweden so much when he describes the solidarity and the tomorrow society that he strives for. Instead, he goes back to the biblical tradition that Sweden has left behind. And he quotes the Apostle Paul, and he gives other examples, and he concludes by quoting another famous social democratic leader, maybe the most successful social democratic leader in the Western world during the last couple of decades, which is Tony Blair. And he was a politician who kept his Christian faith in the closet during his time in office, but he's talked about it afterwards. But you see in his values what society he envisions. And it's not a society built on autonomous values, but on more solidarity values built on another basis. And he quotes Tony Blair saying about his view on socialism: "It is a moral purpose to life, a set of values, a belief in society, in cooperation, in achieving together what we are not able to achieve alone. It is how I try to live my life, the simple truths. I am worth no more than anyone else. I am my brother's keeper. I will not walk by on the other side. We aren't simply people set in isolation from each other, face to face with eternity, but members of the same family, community, the same human race." And Göran Persson states that his view of socialism is the same as Tony Blair's. And most of us are not prime ministers, but we are citizens, we are individuals in a society, and it's up to us as academics, as members of a same society, to evaluate what values we want to build tomorrow's nation and societies on. Thank you for listening.